Kia ora koutou. Jeff Rogers will just be chairing the session this morning. So I'd like to introduce Santiago Pujol, who is the Park and Paulay Distinguished Lecturer for this year. So Santiago is a Professor of Civil Engineering at the University of Canterbury. Prior to moving to New Zealand in early 2020, he was a Professor of Civil Engineering at this Purdue University in Indiana for about 15 years. His experience includes earthquake engineering, evaluation and strengthening of existing structures, responsive concrete, reinforced concrete to impulsive loads and earthquake demands, instrumentation and testing of structures, and failure investigations. He's a fellow of the American Concrete Institute and a member of ACI committees on torsion and shear, simplified design, disaster reconnaissance, and high-strength reinforcement. He's also a member of the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, Associate Editor of Earthquake Spectra, and at the start of this year, he was appointed as the Director of Te Hirangaru Quake Corps, National Centre on Earthquake Resilience. So with that, I'd like to invite Santiago up to give his presentation.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking also Sabina, Jen, and Amy, and thanking especially David for the idea of making this presentation, the Park and Paulay presentation for this Congress. When I met Laurie this morning, I said to her, it's going to be very hard to follow her act. And indeed, this is going to be hard. I like to make a case here that in our disciplines, and I must confess what you're going to see is a little bit biased towards structural engineering and reinforced concrete, but maybe there's a justification with these portraits that we have in front of us. But in general, in our professions, in relation to earthquake engineering, we've learned a lot through surprises and trial and error. So I'd like to show you some cases where we've gone in the wrong direction only to come back to what may be the right direction. I want to show you cases where what we thought we have discovered doesn't work. And I'm doing this with a sort of biased intent, which is to sell the idea that we need to keep doing research. Maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but you see, Quake Corps is, has a final term of 2028, and after that we have to apply for a rebid. And I think it's fundamental that we take advantage of opportunities created by Quake Corps to interact. The technical societies need to work, I think, more closely with the research community to solve all these research questions that we still have because, again, we've been plagued by surprises. So I'd like to start with the case of what has happened in relationship to walls and drift. And I'd like to present this case by mentioning this person, Tachu Naito, very famous in Japan, not so famous outside Japan, not sure why. He was brilliant, and he did a lot of good for Japanese earthquake engineering. Naito designed buildings like this one. This building survived the devastating earthquake of Kanto in 1923 that flattened Tokyo. Other buildings that were designed by Naito also survived this horrific event. And that caught the attention of the American earthquake engineering community. So they invited him to explain how did he do it. And he wrote this paper. Just imagine, about 100 years ago. And in this paper, he has very interesting insight like this, where he says, look, my general principle is to build stiff construction. To make the period of the building short. He says, in that regard, walls are very important. Shear walls, if you will. Because what we need to do is minimize deformation. 100 years ago, he said that. And I like to emphasize his idea of minimizing deformation. When he was asked, what about strength? Because, you know, the way we teach, the way we do structural design, we place a lot of emphasis on strength and forces and so on. He was asked, what about strength? And he said, yeah, sure. You need to have some lateral strength. And as John Hare was saying yesterday, quoting Hardy Cross, the strength is essential, otherwise it's unimportant. Interestingly, Cross was not talking about earthquakes. Cross was talking about gravity when he said that. But of course, that's even more relevant in earthquakes. Naito said, look, put a lateral force of about 15% of the weight of the building, designed for that. But other than that, concentrate on the deformations. Minimize drift, minimize distortion. That's what's going to damage your structure. 100 years ago, Naito said that. If you read through this paper, and I really recommend you do, he talked about things that were mentioned yesterday in one of the plenary sessions. There should be rewards for symmetry, continuity. There should be rewards. We should pay attention to tying everything together well. And one thing that catches your eye when you read the work of Naito is his emphasis on observation. He didn't just do things on the basis of calculation. He paid a lot of attention to observation. He was trained in a school of thought that started in the late 1800s in Japan, where there was a big sort of transformation of Japan. They opened their doors to quote-unquote Western thinking. And so he was trained in the scientific method. And he went out there and looked at what worked and what didn't. And he has quotes like this one. In one frame building, 100% of the light fixtures were destroyed, while in the wall building, 58% of them were destroyed. Ruben Boroshek was mentioning something similar yesterday, and Ken Elwood emphasized that. You know, when I went to school, I was taught the opposite. In the wall building that is stiffer, the acceleration-sensitive components get damaged most. Well, that goes against that. And what Ruben showed yesterday, and I'm going to show again here, goes against that too. Here's a surprise that keeps surprising us. Naito also looked at buildings and they classified them. He classified them in terms of period. And he saw that the flimsier buildings, and I know there's another word to talk about flimsiness, but it gets mixed up with deformation capacity. The flimsier the building, the longer the period, the more damage he saw. Very interesting observation. At about the same time, or a few years later, on the other side of the world, in California, at Caltech, BIO discovered, so to speak, the earthquake spectrum. And I would like to think most of us here are very much familiar with the earthquake spectrum. Well, there are really three spectra that we should think about. There's the acceleration spectrum, which I'm showing here. There's the velocity spectrum and the displacement spectrum. But the one that most of us look at, the one that was first introduced and most people pay the most attention to, was the acceleration spectrum. And in that sense, that's a tragedy, and I'll explain why. But the idea was, look, as the period gets longer, you get less acceleration. That must be good. the Californians thought. Well, that went in the exact opposite direction of what Naito said. And that went on for a while, to the point that the first codes in America said precisely that. Make your structure flimsy, so to speak. I don't want to say flexible, because flexibility gets mixed up with deformability. And those are two very different things. Flexibility is the inverse of stiffness. And that refers to the initial slope of the load deflection curve. But that's very different from deformability, which relates to how far you can push something or bend or distort something. Those are very different concepts. And God, even when I go to Wellington and I get on an Uber, I'm always tempted to ask, aren't you worried about the next earthquake? And very often they start teaching me and saying, oh, well, no, our houses are very flexible. That's good. So anyways, look, this code essentially said, make things flimsy. You know, you have to put force on your building, push that building model sideways with some sort of shear. And I apologize, I do have some equations in my presentation, but think of them as pictorial representations of concepts. Push the building sideways with some fraction of the weight, W as weight. That fraction, C, refers to this coefficient. And what I want to show is the period is in the denominator there, meaning long period, smaller forces, right? There's also a K factor there, which I like to think of it as a penalty factor. The penalty factor was tabulated like this, and I sort of hid most of the text here, not to distract you too much with unimportant things, but I want to highlight two entries in this table. One refers to the box system. That was their terminology to refer to wall buildings. And the other entry here refers to frames. And the box system was penalized, and the frame system was rewarded. The building code in America, the first building codes, were rewarding people for making buildings flimsy. And that went on for quite a while, even as late as never mind, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before that, this same committee in California was asked, when they proposed this idea to concentrate on forces and have this minimum base here, they were asked, what about drift? What about deformation? You know, people had heard of Naito and his ideas. So they said, oh, we entertained the question of drift. We thought about it. And we thought about three things in relation to drift: health and safety, non-structural elements, and something they called motion sickness. As if a building in an earthquake was something like a boat. Nothing like that. Anyways. And they say very interesting things. This is a report that came along with the building code. It says, well, yeah, if there's too much drift, the glass might break, and things from the facade might fall, and that should be regulated because that might hurt someone. But other than that, these other ideas that you need to protect the non-structural elements. The first keynote yesterday was talking about protecting the asset, right? Protecting the investment. And this other thing about what people might feel or not, that's excessive paternalism. We don't need to worry about drift. And in fact, they say right there in their commentary, we're not going to say anything about drift or deformation in the code. That doesn't belong to the code. And as I was indicating earlier, that kind of thinking went on for quite a while. This quote that says, lateral displacement is seldom critical in a building. That quote was given by these very smart, very important people who made a big difference in our profession as late as 1961. Forget drift. It took until 1980 or so, although the exact date for the reference is 1981. But this quote here, or this title, this citation, refers to something that was presented in Istanbul. That's Istanbul there in the background, by this guy, Mehdi Sozen, who in 1980, this was in the World Conference in Istanbul in 1980, on the basis of, oops, went too far, on the basis of experimentation, made the case that we actually have to pay a lot of attention to drift and deformation or displacement, whatever you want to call it. And I wanted to show this picture because it shows the level of deformation to which they subjected these models of buildings. And I also wanted to show this picture because I always find this portrait of Jack Maley, whom you might know, very amusing. Yeah. Those were different times, eh? But they were quite brave to go against the sort of conventional thinking of the time and say things like this. Drift control should be at the center of the design process, not a side check that you do later. It should be at the center of the design process. In a way, what they were saying is that, yeah, we've been looking at the acceleration spectrum thanks to the amazing work by Biot and so on, but we should, in fact, be looking at the displacement spectrum, because displacement is what drives damage. It's the distortion what drives damage. That's what breaks the jib that the insurance company has to pay for all the time. In a way, what they were saying is that, yeah, acceleration may be decreasing as you increase period, but the displacements do the opposite. The flimsier your structure, the longer its period, the more it distorts. And that means the more likely you are to get into trouble. The more likely you are to get into trouble in terms of what may happen to the structure, and certainly the more likely you are to get into trouble with all these expensive finishes, facades, doorways, and so on. I'll address the issue of the acceleration-sensitive components in a moment. But for now, let me just say that this idea kind of caught on slowly, but it did catch on. And by now, there are at least 2 books out there that speak of displacement-based design or drift-driven design. But even more interesting, there's been a lot of evidence that we've been looking at, that we've been collecting, that supports this idea that, again, can be traced all the way back to Naito. The idea that robust, stiff buildings do well. And Mr. Lucas from the Insurance Council yesterday was asking for evidence that we can design better so they can lower our premiums. There's evidence. This photo I took in 2010 in Viña del Mar. This building right there had already gone through the 1985 Viña del Mar earthquake, and then it went through the Maule earthquake. When we went there, we were not allowed in the building because the building was fully occupied. Eventually, we sort of became friendly with one of the tenants, or owners rather, and then they let us in and they showed us, you could barely see cracks in the walls at all. I mean, the worst thing was one picture frame had kind of made a mark on the wall, but big deal. These buildings have done very well. These buildings in Chile are notorious, or famous rather, for having robust, stiff walls. And everything that is hatched in gray here represents concrete, reinforced concrete wall. And I love this picture or this drawing because it shows the thickness of these walls. 60, 70 centimeter thick walls. No joke. And lots of them. So much wall that it takes 6% of the floor area of the building, 3% in each direction. But that has worked very well. It has worked very well in Chile, as Ruben can tell you about better than I can. It has also worked very well in Japan. And I borrowed a slide from Professor Toshi Ichinose, who collected data data related to the Kobe earthquake. And they show you here how much damage has occurred to reinforced concrete buildings in Kobe again. These are sort of all the buildings grouped together. And then he contrasts this here with damage occurring in wall buildings. And I think all of us can agree that the wall buildings are much less likely to have severe damage or damage at all, never mind collapse. The wall buildings have done quite well. And there's more. These are data from 1,600 buildings or so that have been surveyed after about 15 earthquakes. And the buildings are represented by all these dots here. Each dot is a building. The x-axis represents amount of column, and the y-axis represents amount of wall. And the people in the audience who have been in my classroom have seen this, and they're probably tired of hearing me saying this. Yeah, amount of wall, if you put it this way, amount of wall is critical. There's a level here, a threshold, beyond which buildings with sufficient wall don't get much damaged. And these are buildings without good detailing. These are buildings with fairly mediocre detailing. If you have enough wall, if you have enough stiffness, by and large, things work well. That's what the evidence shows. And this is having an impact. I mean, we are talking about functional recovery and so on here, and we have these plans to change things over a fairly generous time frame. Other countries are not feeling they have much time anymore. This is the building code that they used in Turkey until recently. It was produced in 2018. They're going to scrap it. There's a new code. It's 2 pages long. Not exaggerating, 2 pages long. It's been approved by all the committees and societies and so on in record time. It's sitting on Mr. Erdogan's desk right now, as far as I know. And he needs to sign it. That's the one thing missing, his signature, I'm told. But apparently he's more worried about his political, competitor, so to speak, or rivals than the building code. But it's already out there. The engineers in Turkey are already at least considering it. And it has a couple of very critical lines. One line says you need to have more wall than indicated by that line that I just showed you. You need to be up here. That's one line of the code. And the other line of the code, which in a way achieves the same or takes you to the same place, is it says the drift shall not exceed, the story drift shall not exceed 1%. Done. That's your new code in Turkey. And yeah, they could be talking about probabilities and functional recovery and so on, but they feel they don't have, they cannot afford that. They've lost so much in the past 30 years. They want rapid action. They don't want to accumulate more buildings that are going to kill more people. So they want fast action and they want dramatic action. So this is the sort of end of the first case I wanted to show you where, we started going in one way, or at least Naito, the Japanese, were indicating we should go one way, the way of stiffness and short period and robustness. When we discovered the acceleration spectra, or spectrum, we started going the other way, and now we're turning back, going towards square one again. But I want to now show you another example where we've had to change the way we think. This example has to do with shear in reinforced concrete. And again, the structural engineers in the room here would probably recognize this expression that, according to Michael Fardis, is the first instance of capacity design that is documented in sort of an official publication. This appeared in the same book I mentioned before by Newmark and others in 1961. And that essentially says that, well, you need to select what you want to yield first, right? And design everything else to accommodate the demands related to that yielding mechanism, right? It was the first time that they thought about hierarchy and the failure mechanism, so to speak. The first time they thought about something that later was coined, again, capacity design. And the gist of the expression is that if you think that, say in this case, a beam will yield at both ends, based on that and a little bit of statics, you can estimate the worst shear that can occur in a beam. And you can do something similar for columns and so on. In a way, they figured out, or they thought they figured out, the problem of shear in concrete back in 1961. Well, by 1968, we were still having shear failures. And these were shear failures that occurred in Japan. By 1971, San Fernando earthquake that Laurie mentioned was so critical, we were still having shear failures. It almost looked like back then they thought transverse reinforcement was optional. You can barely see the transverse reinforcement in these columns. And then in New Zealand, it wasn't only until 1976 that we changed the code to require more stirrups and ties and so on. Henry was talking yesterday about gradual progress and gradual improvement of our codes. Yeah, sometimes it's a little bit too gradual. It took a few too many years to figure out the importance of ties. Finally, again, the codes changed and we thought we had figured out this problem. You design for the worst possible shear, assuming things yield at their ends. Easy. Well, that didn't work. Here's another surprise. White and Sozen tested, in this case, a column. This is shear and this is deflection. And all of you have seen these spaghetti soup type of plots that we call hysteretic loops, right? Or hysteretic curves. But the idea here is that you may be able to achieve a certain strength once, but you don't reach that necessarily twice. It turns out that we were thinking about what happens when you sort of load things once or in one direction only, and not necessarily what happens when we load things back and forth. It took decades before we thought of that. It took a while. But finally, we did figure that out, and thanks to that, we have abundant transverse reinforcement in our structures now. And in this case, I wanted to show this and make direct reference to the work of Tom Paulay, who did a lot to improve the way in which we design coupling beams. We've done a lot to improve the response of reinforced concrete to shear. And thank God for that, and I'll allude to this later. If it wasn't because of that, what happened in Christchurch would have been much worse. So that's a second example where it has taken us a while and a few surprises to change the way we do things. I'd like to now give you another example. In this case, I want to talk about the role of strength and the role of dissipation in response, at least of reinforced concrete. Again, Naito, back in the early 1920s, said strength, not so critical, just to have enough. That's hard to swallow, right? You think the more strength, the better. So I wanted to show you these tests that were done in 1979 by Dan Abrams at the University of Illinois, where Newmark worked, and then later Sozen worked too, and Abrams was there with them. They tested, in this case, two building models. Both of them were pretty much the same geometry-wise, except one had a wall with a lot of reinforcement, and the other one had a wall with 4 times less reinforcement. And that was the main lateral load resisting system, one wall. And again, one was essentially 4 times stronger than the other. And look at the difference in response. you can probably not even see it, or if you don't see it, you don't see it very well. That's the point I'm trying to make. One building had 4 times more reinforcement. In many ways, it was 4 times stronger. That didn't matter. The response was essentially the same. And that we still struggle with that in our profession. We're so obsessed with forces that we don't quite see that often. And it still bothers me, and it has bothered many people. In 1984, another Japanese, by the name Shimazaki in this case, went on to test that idea with numbers. Not on a shake table, but with sort of numerical models. And Naito looked at oscillators with different load deflection characteristics. I'm going to concentrate on 2 of these oscillators, the one that he called Model 2, and then the one that he called Model 4. And what he was trying to do was to answer the question, is it true that if I make something much stronger, the response really is not that sensitive to strength? Is that true? It's hard to believe again. And he created these very ingenious plots where the x-axis represents strength. The y-axis, think of it as a measure of displacement, okay? And you have different plots that vary, or the variable between plot and plot is period. So you have short period, slightly longer period, and so on from left to right and from top to bottom. Oh, I have a typo here. That should be 6/3. So these are short periods, and as I move to the right, the periods are getting longer. And what these plots showed to Shimazaki is that the displacements were fairly constant despite the strength varying very much from left to right, except for the oscillators with very, very short periods. So strength didn't matter, except for the very short periods. And that is why, until very recently, what we did with short periods was different. Remember, we divide by k mu, and we multiply by something else. We multiplied by mu. For short periods, k mu and mu are different. Well, they used to be. Now, in the new TS 1170.5, that's no longer the case. I'm not very comfortable with that. I'm sorry, but that's because what happens in very short periods is different. But never mind that. For sort of a wide range of the domain of possibilities, strength is fairly unimportant, like Cross said. And this is what Shimazaki saw for this type of oscillator. And I want to show you what he saw for the other type of oscillator I mentioned, Model 4, which I don't know if you noticed, had a lot of what they call pinching. It had much less fat loops, like this. You see, this is oscillator 2, this is oscillator 4. 2, 4. Not much difference. And one has very narrow loops, and the other one doesn't. This was later confirmed by Nigel Priestley. Don't get me wrong, dampers are great. I'd rather have the fat loops than the narrow loops, but they're not always as useful as we think. That's another surprise that has come about through the years of research. But let me summarize these initial cases by just saying that as long as there is good detailing, which took us a while to realize what that meant, demand is best expressed in terms of deformation. That's sort of the essence of these backs and forths and trial and error exercises that have led us to where we are right now. But that refers to deformation demand. So now I want to switch to the other side of the equation, so to speak, deformation capacity. Well, for deformation capacity, when I went to school, they taught us to think of these things that they call plastic hinges. And if you dig, the concept of plastic hinge is actually quite old. It was first introduced in 1954 by these people here, McAllister and Sees, again at Urbana, Illinois. And the essence of the idea here was that if you have an element like that, and there's shear and moment and so on. You might have a moment diagram like this, but your curvature diagram will have sort of a healthy region where bending concentrates. A region where things yield and become plastic and whatnot. We call that the plastic hinge, and everyone in this room has heard of plastic hinges. Everyone in this room that has ever opened a structural engineering book or earthquake engineering book must have seen this equation that describes how a plastic hinge works. And those of you who have been in my classroom might realize, oh, this actually has to do with the second theorem of the moment area theorems. This is based on mechanics that at the moment seem hard to argue against. Geometry. Strain divided by distance to neutral axis gives you curvature, and again, the theorems help us go from curvature to deflection. Hard to argue against all of that. Well, here's another surprise. After the Chile earthquake of 2010, people noticed there was a lot of concentrated damage at the bases of walls. And once again in Japan, Takahashi and Ichinose were wondering what happened. And they did these tests. And they observed, again, a lot of concentrated deformation at the bases of these walls. And they produced this cartoon in a paper that they published, when was it, 2013, where they say, well, you know, on the side of tension, yes, the plasticity may be spreading over a long plastic hinge, if you will. But on the side in compression, the plasticity is not spreading. It's concentrating. And that area seems to have to do with the thickness of the element there. Ha! We never thought of that until 2013. So in that sense, this wasn't working at all, according to Takahashi and Ichinose, because we always thought this quantity that we call LP, which refers to the length of that area of plasticity, we always thought that's related to the depth of the element, not the thickness. I mean, we're sort of an order of magnitude off there. And sure enough, if you look at measurement in the y-axis versus calculation, based on that equation, things don't look very good, do they? There are many reasons. You know, the initial tests by McAllister were done on beams tested in one direction. There were no cycles. Those were beams. Now we're looking at walls, and the walls are subjected to cycles. And the mechanism of failure can be anyone's guess. Bars buckle and fracture and low cycle fatigue. Sometimes the dam wall sort of buckles out of the plane. There's so many things going on beyond what the equation that we put our trust on is based on. And people have been trying really hard to try to address that. These are pictures that show all the things that were tried by Carlos Arteta and Jack Maley, who came back from Chile saying, shoot, the plasticity isn't spreading as we thought. We need to figure out how to make the compression zone longer. Well, they tried all these configurations in elements subjected to compression to try to spread the plasticity, so to speak. Didn't work. In every test that they did, the deformations in the compression side of the wall concentrated. And that's why today, when we try to calculate the deformation capacity of things, we don't use mechanics anymore. This is kind of embarrassing. We use regressions. That's a regression. Very good regression. Nothing wrong with the idea of regression. In fact, it's a little bit embarrassing in a way. When I was in my master's, I had to write a thesis about deformation capacity of columns. And I didn't know what to do. So the kind of easiest thing for me to do was to try to figure out some parameters that seemed relevant and run a regression line. And I submitted that as, you know, with my eyes closed, saying, I'm going to get a lot of heat for this, you know. I expected my supervisors to, you know, demand mechanics and geometry and so on. They said, great, this is cool. And we wrote a paper. Then it didn't get rejected. And then, yeah, you know how that feels, don't you? Other people looked at the idea, and then they sort of introduced more parameters, and they made the regression bigger and better. Thank God they don't cite that initial paper we wrote. They cite the other papers that came later. And I say thank God because it is embarrassing that we cannot solve this question with mechanics, but we have to solve it with regressions. But that's what it is. And it gets worse, because those regressions, at least for walls, we calibrated on the basis of walls that didn't have lap splices at their bases. You know, lap splices when you're trying to connect two bars together by overlapping them. Well, this plot here shows deformations measured on the surface of a concrete wall by Charles Kirby at UC. And the idea here is that you see a lot of plastic deformation on the side of the wall in tension. Again, concentration of deformations on the side of the wall in compression, very much confirming what I just showed you that was said by Takahashi and Ichinose. The plastic hinge is long on one side, but not long on the other side. No surprise there. The surprise is that when we introduce lap splices, like this, at the base of the wall, then the concentration of deformation happened on both sides of the wall. The side in compression and the side in tension. You see very high strains here at the base of the wall, some higher strains here, but certainly not the same spread of deformation. And things got worse. Sorry, it's a kind of pessimistic kind of thing here, but it is what it is. You know, it's all about the surprises that we keep running into. When we staggered the splices, so they're all not happening at one level, but we kind of move them apart, we thought we were going to make the problem better. Didn't get better, it got worse. There's even more concentration of deformation now, because you're sort of stiffening a longer region in the wall. What a mess. And it has consequences. These are two of the walls tested by Charlie. This one without the lap splices, this one with lap splices. At the same level of deformation, completely different damage. And we don't want to have that in our building. That's not very easily repairable. As Ken said yesterday, you can repair anything if you throw enough money into it. So, yeah, but that'll be a tough repair. And that is an example of the kinds of surprises that we've run into when we talk about sort of the structural side of things. At least from my biased perspective, I thought I should go a little bit beyond structural engineering, or at least reinforced concrete, and talk about other things. So I'm doing that, but please give me the benefit of understanding that this is not my specialty. I was trained in reinforced concrete, but I do notice that in terms of ground motion, we've run into a whole bunch of surprises too. To begin with, plate tectonics was only generally accepted in the 1950s or 60s. Just think about that. In that sense, what we do is fairly recent. We talked about spectra, right? And I showed you the first spectrum ever produced by Biot. In the 1950s, also, Newmark organized the ideas about spectra with the sort of famous tripartite plot that most of you must have seen. It's very hard to understand how to read the tripartite plot. And if you didn't bring your tripartite goggles, let me help you there. Yeah, the idea was that there's a range of periods where the response in terms of displacement is fairly flat. And I'm guessing you're saying, I don't see flatness there. Look at it this way. That's a log-log plot. Again, very hard to read. But the same spectra, or the same idea, can be looked at in arithmetic scale. The idea is that, yes, the spectral displacement increases with period up to some period. And then from there on, it remains flat. That's what Newmark suggested. That's what I was taught when we went to school. That's what was showed in some of the slides yesterday in one of the parallel sessions. Well, that's not what happens, at least not all the time. there are earthquakes that, for whatever reason, keep climbing to the right in this plot. This dark, thick line is from Nepal, dominated by a ridiculous period of 5 seconds. There are videos online showing people sort of trying to cope on the streets with the earthquake, and if you time their backs and forwards, yeah, the period of the ground motion was about 5 seconds. Amazing, ridiculous, but also concerning in some ways, and I do admit this is all linear, and if I looked at nonlinear response, it's different, but what happens to a base-isolated structure that is out here, and you were hoping for this, and you get that? Again, in the linear range of response, at least. Or let me put it in a different way. The more we measure, the more we surprise ourselves. Look at this plot. PGA versus year. And the ordinates refer to the maximum PGA measured in a given year. Talk about inflation. Yeah. Ruben, you were mentioning yesterday the quality of the records and the instruments. Yeah, that has to do with this. But at the same time, when I integrate acceleration, well, if I do it right, I should get velocity, right? It happens when you integrate the record. You see the spikes in the acceleration record that might not mean anything kind of get filtered out when you integrate. Well, velocity too has been increasing with time. And there have been some very uncomfortable surprises. That's Chi-Chi, Taiwan, 1999. This is Turkey, 2023. Very difficult to design for an earthquake with that type of velocity, because it turns out the velocity of the ground is related to how quickly, how fast the displacement spectrum increases as period increases. These are very demanding motions, very difficult to design for. And you could argue, well, but yeah, why PGV? Why? We talk about Z, which is related to PGA. Well, that's another surprise. For many years, we spent most of our time thinking about PGA. But even in 1933, Westergaard had already said, no, it's not PGA, it's PGV. This is from an article that was published by Engineering News Record. Very short little article. He said, it's PGV. What matters? Well, let's put it to the test. So these are data of percent of buildings in different cities with bad damage or collapse versus PGA. These are data collected from Turkey. There is some maybe weak correlation. If you squint your eyes enough, you might see correlation there. But if you plot PGV in the x-axis instead of PGA, you get slightly better correlation. And we see that in many instances. We see that on the computer too when we run simulations. We find out PGV correlates better with damage. There's another surprise for you. And there are more, but I don't have the time or enough expertise. But when I went to school, there wasn't velocity pulses to talk about. They popped out of the blue. The same thing I can say about directivity. That was another surprise that has happened at least during my years related to this profession. And then there's the issue of it was higher than expected. We all know what that feels like, right? Higher than expected. What bothers me is that it keeps happening. Maybe it shouldn't surprise us, given what I just showed you about our records of PGA and PGV and how they keep increasing. There was a very good paper by Strasser recently that says essentially we're going to keep getting surprised because we don't have enough instruments even now to measure all the possibilities. So the more we measure, the more increase we're going to see in our maxima and in our estimated hazards too. You know. And this suggests the same. This is a map of Turkey, 2023. That was the area there that was affected by that huge earthquake. And from that area, they had quite a few instruments, and I picked one here, and I'm showing you the displacement spectra that was sort of offered by the building code for the 500-year record. or 500-year earthquake, the 2,500-year earthquake, and then these other lines show what was measured. Much higher than expected. In Japan, in 2010, they looked at 400 years of records, historic records. And they figured, yeah, most of the earthquakes that have affected the north of Japan, the area of Sendai, have been magnitude 7, magnitude 8. And that's because we have ruptures that can occur of certain length, and that makes sense and so on. 2011 comes, not one of those ruptures occurs, but 2 ruptures happen at the same time. And they don't get a magnitude 8, they get a magnitude 9. And all of you know a magnitude 9 is 32 times more powerful than a magnitude 8. Needless to say, what has estimated initially was quite the underestimate. And of course, that has happened very close to home too. In the Kaikoura event, 30 or so fault segments ruptured. And I was talking about this with Brendan Bradley the other day, and he said, well, yeah, we knew most of those segments were there. What was really surprising is that they all ruptured at the same time. Another surprise. And then to wrap these things up, so we can share some questions, let's also admit that because maybe of all these surprises, we're having to change the way we look at things. Also because of what we perceive are the expectations of the society. We have realized we don't have to, or we cannot, design just to avoid collapse. We need to design to avoid disruption. And our dear Christchurch is, of course, a very good example of that. 2 collapses in an earthquake that exceeded all expectations is a fairly good record. And I think we need to thank Park and Paulay for all the effort they invested and all the research they did to teach us how to do better detailing, because I think what saved these buildings was the detailing, except, again, for 2 rather unfortunate exceptions where things were not done the best way. The idea is that ductility saves lives, but it doesn't save the investment. We need to control drift and deformation to control the investment. And the Japanese have been doing this for years. This is Sendai. I went to Sendai after the earthquake in 2011. You could check in the hotel in the CBD. You could go shopping. You could go to dinner. Of course, the area affected by the tsunami was a mess. It was a terrible disaster. I didn't even have the heart to go there, and my research was about buildings. But it's admirable that Sendai survived this monster of an earthquake, and this is one of the ground motions that was measured near Sendai, and I'm comparing it here with El Centro, the universal earthquake, right? Northridge, that changed the way we look at things in California, Laurie, and Mexico 85, which was yet another surprise. Look at that motion. Sendai survived that. Talk about resilience. They survived because they have buildings like this one, because they kept the tradition that Naito started. And again, the question is always, no, but if you make the building too stiff, then the non-structural elements are going to suffer, especially the ones that we call acceleration sensitive, like the ceilings. Well, do they? And I go back to Naito. Where is the quantitative data? And again, this comes from Chile, from Renato Calcaño, whom we've been collaborating with. This is a very, very interesting plot that Ruben alluded to yesterday. This is percentage of buildings. This is level of damage in ceilings and sprinklers and so on. And we have 2 types of buildings, wall buildings and frame buildings here. And what I want you to see is that this indicates bad damage to ceilings and piping and so on. It's more frequent in the frame than in the wall. The wall building, at least in Chile so far, has done better in terms of non-structural damage to things that we think are acceleration sensitive. And Ruben alluded to many possible explanations, non-linearity, maybe a little bit of slip on the foundation, or we don't know. Talk about a surprise. It's hard to believe. So hard to believe that we're running our own tests at the University of Canterbury. We have this brand new simulator where we can move floors independent from one another to try to understand what happens in a... Did it play kind of choppy? Oh, that's too bad. Oh, there it goes. So we're trying to simulate what happens in a given story in a high-rise building without testing the high-rise building, to test the idea that in a stiffer building, the acceleration-sensitive components get damaged more or not. That's what we're trying to do in uniaxial fashion in this case. In triaxial fashion, in a test that we're going to do, and this is a collaboration of many of us in Quaycore. This is a test we're going to do in Taiwan soon, and we have every possible type of non-structural element, the latest partition technology, brackets to support sprinklers and so on. And the idea here is, in this building that is quite eccentric, I admit, we have the option to put in or take out braces on one face of the building, and with that we're going to control not only the torsion but the amount of drift that occurs on one side of the building. We want to see if the stiffer structure with less torsion produces, in fact, more or less damage in the non-structural elements. Almost done. So we have many challenges that I think force us to collaborate. We need to figure out what we're going to do with all the buildings that were built out there before we realized many of these surprises. And that's not just the job of structural engineers. That will take interdisciplinary work. No question about that. Inevitably, we need to fix some of these buildings. We need to figure out how to do that in an easy, affordable way. There was a lot of talk yesterday about functional recovery. That's all great. But it looks at the building as a separate, isolated entity. I think Laurie is right. We need to think of functional recovery of the entire system. My building might be okay, but if the building next door is leaning towards my building, I don't have functional recovery. In many ways, we need to think of this in a bigger scale. And that's going to take some money. And we can talk about the cost of making buildings better. I have kind of backup slides because that's sort of the default question. But I really like the idea of these bonds and the idea of capital planning to avoid the controversies about policy. There's got to be a way to help the owner who got stuck in a bad building and they don't have a way to pay for the fix. And I'll tell you what, if we don't help them pay for the fix now, for the retrofit, we'll pay anyways, eventually, more after the earthquake. And we can talk about figures that I have about that. We cannot work in such isolation. We need to work with others. We need to work with you guys. In America, we do that a lot, but we need to work closer to the Chileans and the Japanese, the Chinese too. There's a lot of evidence out there of things that work that we don't need to reinvent. And to end, I want to repeat something that Laurie said too. We need to look at these problems in a regional scale. When we change things in the building code one way or another, we should have sort of a digital twin of, if not New Zealand, Wellington. We should have sensors out there that allow us to figure out what happened and then go act fast. There's so many things that we still need to do. I think Quaycore gives us wonderful opportunities to do that. Let's work more closely together. The technical societies and the research community need to inform all these changes that we need sort of on a continuous basis, not every now and then when MB gives us the opportunity. So with that, I yield the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation, Santiago. Let's invite Laurie Johnson back up. So maybe if you'd both take a seat, I'll give you a mic.
David Hopkins. I was a student of Bob Park and Tom Paulay. I helped set up the fund for Park and Paulay. They would have been very happy to be here during your stimulating and thought-provoking address. Thank you very much indeed. That's all I have to say.
Thank you.
So thank you, David. So we'll run through a condensed question time. So it was, first question is from Mark Ryburn. Regarding your comments on performance of walls with lap splices, how did the well-performing buildings in Chile splice their rebar and walls? Do you know that detail?
They splice the bars at the base of the wall. Unfortunately, I understand that is changing, and there was at least one collapse where the splices may have played a role. There's some debate about that. The Alto Rio building in Concepcion ended up on its side, and again, maybe the splices were not the trigger, but clearly splices failed, and they may have played a critical role. There's also a series of another 10 buildings or so that we noticed, in which we noticed lap splice failures in Chile. So there was quite a bit of damage related to lap splices in Chile too.
So next question from Rajesh Takao. Drift response depends on stiffness. If you add reinforcement to make the structure stronger without enlarging the section, the stiffness, hence the response, does not change. Isn't it normal?
Well, that's what the evidence suggests, yeah. But you know, the way sort of the design process is set up, we're sort of rewarded by adding reinforcement to the system, when that doesn't necessarily help. Again, it might help in the short period range, but not in the other ranges of response. And John Bonacci did some tests that were very interesting, where he tested essentially single degree of freedom systems, and he changed the reinforcement ratio and the structure, and the response was fairly insensitive to those changes. Yeah.
So one question here, functional recovery is a different way to face design as opposed to only focusing on life safety. Would you agree that it's not about the material or the number of walls, but more just about the drift?
Yeah, of course it's about the drift. You can control the drift in many ways. Wall is just sort of a dumb-proof way to control drift. But yeah, if you can control drift with steel braces, friction dampers, and so on, why not? You can control drift with base isolation. The reason I tend to mention walls first is that it's a system that has been proven time and again. It's very reliable, at least on the basis of field evidence.
So new questions come through from Caleb. Questions for both. Who drives the changes that you have outlined? Engineering sector versus a centralized agency?
Well, I think it's a collaboration of both, but I think you need the central agency providing the leadership. The community, I think in the case of like the Spur report, the community spoke, but it really took having a government willing to pick it up and provide the space then for the action to take place.
I agree. I would also suggest that sometimes in the research community, we're a little bit too quick to play devil's advocate. Sometimes it's my own colleagues who tell me, no, well, if we require lower drift limits, things are going to get more expensive, and therefore we shouldn't go there. And I always think, well, it's not your money that we're talking about. It's of course, the owner's money, and that's important. But why are we the first to sort of jump to take their position? Now, with respect to that, Naito himself said it. It takes about 100 years ago he said it, and it still applies. We've done the numbers, and I have some figures. It takes 1 to 2% of the total cost of the structure to lower the drift from 2 or 2.5% to 1 and 1.5%. You could argue that in sort of absolute terms that's a lot of money, but in relative terms it's not. I don't think so. If you compare that with the losses, the suffering, all the mess we're going to have to go through the next time there's an earthquake, that's a worthy investment. And countries like Chile, my home country, Colombia, poor country, with lots of trouble. I grew up there in the 90s when all sorts of hell broke loose thanks to the drug cartels. Colombia afforded it. Colombia lowered the drift limits to 1.5% decades ago. It can be done. And again, we don't have to be the ones always playing the other side. Let's play our cards first, and then let's see how the other side responds.
One final question from the app, which was from Jeff Bird. With regard to the wall/stiffness argument, please comment with regards to the recent low damage technologies, so viscous dampers, BRBs, etc.
Those are great ideas, the low damage technologies. My only reservation is that we don't have as much evidence from the field about their benefits. We have plenty of sort of computational evidence, laboratory evidence with its limitations. What we need to recognize there is that the other option, say robust walls, there's a lot of evidence from the field to back that up. By no means I'm saying we should not explore those options, but what I'm saying is, they come with that caveat that they haven't been tested in the field at large scale.
We do need to keep it, so Ken's already here with the microphone. So,
Great. Laurie, one thing I think we struggle with in the lifeline space in New Zealand is not sort of one central government agency to fund the sorts of guidelines and so on that you refer to. Any experiences, New Zealand well, know the US experience well, and I know the situation in the US with government agencies is obviously changing, but do you have any suggestions for us as we try to follow your lead in the development of such guidance?
Well, I do think there needs to be more integrated leadership. If it's not one agency, it needs to be some agencies coming together. I think under the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program, we've been able to do that, but with NIST and FEMA and the NSF. But as I mentioned, Lifelines really wasn't given the priority that buildings were, for example, even with that guidance for decades. So it's really taken the community to say, we have to have this. The American Society of Civil Engineers, I think, deals with so many issues. It's 166, or I forget what the number is. I looked it up last night when I was looking at the report card. 166,000 members. They're dealing with just basic construction, delivery, civil engineering, and many different descriptions besides Lifeline. So I think what TECLI did was very, very effective, but I think the challenge with that very earthquake focus was that it wasn't bringing along, a multi-hazard view. So I know there's some talk here, I think there was the announcement of the formation of a national infrastructure agency, but I don't know what the status of that is. I heard that at another conference I was at last September, August, but I do think there needs to be some sort of centralization in thinking about this, because really it's, our infrastructure is supplied by so many different types of organizations, public, private. They have different constituencies they're answering to: shareholders, the public, et cetera. So some centralization of leadership or some council, I think, is essential for us to really address the issue of lifelines.
and just go one final question here from Dave.
And thanking Laurie for an excellent summary of 50 years worth of infrastructure work and lifelines in the US. And my colleague, young Dave here from the Image, and I have had the privilege of being part of that journey, and we've done our best to bring it back to New Zealand. Linking with Ken's question, the New Zealand Lifelines Council continues to try to get the new government agencies to take resilience on board in a broader sense, beyond just the economic business as usual sense. That's a challenge. Question for you, Laurie, is given your close familiarity with so many of the New Zealand initiatives, both institutional and in research, where are the areas that you think New Zealand could help the further development of functional recovery in the US?
I think the thing I've always enjoyed about working in New Zealand is that it is smaller. And it is, when you look at it like an urban environment, You take studying the Christchurch earthquake. For me, everything kind of came together. My 20-plus years at the time of studying disaster recovery became so much clearer and obvious to me because the economy was simple, the social structure was a little simpler than the way, some of the big disasters I've been involved in, like Katrina in New Orleans, were. And so you could really see, like, when policy was enacted, what the ripple effects were and how that sort of policy decision cascaded across the landscape almost. The red zone, I use that one as an example a lot to say that policy initially was really driven by EQC and the multiple repair of land damage. As each aftershock was happening, have to face this land damage issue again, have to go back in and repair. But simple thing, these areas that were red zone didn't have just houses in them. They had schools and churches and dairies and all sorts of other things in it. And so you could quickly see that those people were going to be very impacted as well. So to me, you're a laboratory to some extent for us in the United States because our economy, at least until last week, was more complicated. It might be more primitive going forward. I'm looking to buy some goats and some chickens to keep on my property. But, I think it's a place for experimentation. I think the insurance industry is also a little closer and works more closely than, it's so complicated in the United States. It's so hard. We're regulated. Every state is different. So I do think there are ways to sort of be a laboratory and experiment with some things and see what works and report that out.
A lot of us here do own sheep and chooks. We call them chooks here.
I need some sheep.
With that, I'd like to just thank Laurie Johnson as our Natural Hazards Commission Toka keynote speaker, and Santiago Pujol as our Park and Paulay keynote speaker. So it was the two named keynotes in that, and I think both presentations were very worthy of that. So thank you to the speakers. There was a slightly compressed question session, so if you do have remaining questions, going to volunteer them both as being welcome, being prepared to speak to you over coffee. The next event is just the morning tea next door in the exhibition area, and then we'll be back in here in the same space for a plenary from about 11 o'clock, which is putting people at the heart of earthquake engineering. So thank you very much.